Professor Wergeles here. Make sure you save all your code. I don't want you to lose any of your work. We're going to go into number 4, radios.html. Now in this file, I'm not going to do the complete conversion to jQuery. We're just going to focus on taking what's in the function and translating that into jQuery. I just want to show you, here's how it is in JavaScript, here's how you do it in jQuery. Now in the previous example, we went a step further and actually wrote everything in jQuery. Whereas in radios, we're just going to focus on what's in the function and translate that to jQuery. You'll see I've imported my jQuery library already, where in the previous lecture we did not and we experienced an error. You'll see I have the onClicks. Once I click this button, this JavaScript function will be called, and we're going to implement some jQuery equivalent code inside the function. So let's look at the example we have. This is actually the example we just wrote in the previous lecture, and we're going to translate that to jQuery. So first I'm going to comment out all this code. In this code I did a print, so I'm going to do the same print, and instead of storing it to a variable, I'm going to access the jQuery function. I'm going to put a selector there, so I'm selecting the ID that's equal to Raptor. With jQuery, I can use a CSS selector with a hashtag and put Raptor there, and then I'm grabbing whether it's checked or not. Now this is important to note, and you're going to see this on a quiz and the exam. If I try to use attribute, which I've seen in the previous example, and look for checked, let's see what happens. I'm going to save the code. I'm going to come over here, refresh it, click on get, and you'll see here I'm returning checked. But what happens if I select another option and click on the get radio button? You'll see it also returns checked. So attribute is not working here. Let's come over here to the web and let's search jQuery attribute function, and let's just see what pops up. So make sure you use the jQuery API documentation. A lot of times students will use Stack Overflow, and most likely it's going to lead you in the wrong direction. Try to use the API documentation because it's the official documentation and it's going to be correct. In addition, it's where the test questions are going to come from. I'm not going to test you on Stack Overflow. I'm going to test you on the jQuery API documentation. So let's open this up and let's see what it says. So the attribute is going to get the value of an attribute for the first element in the set of matched elements, or set one or more attributes for every matched element. So if I specify one parameter, it's going to get the value. If I do 2 parameters, it's going to set the value. If I scroll down, you're going to see this here. As of jQuery 1.6, the attribute method returns undefined for attributes that have not been set. To retrieve and change DOM properties such as checked, selected, or disabled, use the prop method. So we tried the attribute method. It's not working. I come to the documentation. It says, of course it doesn't work. If you want checked, selected, or disabled, you got to use the prop method. So if I come over to the prop method, you'll see it gets the value of a property for the first set of matched elements. So here you'll see I can do checked, and that is the example from the documentation. So if I come back here and switch it from attribute to property, save it, come back to the browser, let's move this over, refresh, do a get, you'll see it returns true, select T-Rex, do a get, you'll see it returns false. So I need to use the prop method in this case. Always check the API documentation. Even though you may think you know jQuery, it's better to check the documentation to make sure you're using those functions properly. You'll see here I had to get element by ID, store it to a variable, and then access the checked property here. I could write this in one line, document.getElementById with Raptor as a parameter, .check. Or I could use jQuery, and it's much shorter and easier to use. Now let's look at the set radio button. I'm going to comment this line of code out, and I'm going to use the property method again. If I come back to the documentation, if I want to get a value, I'm going to use 1 parameter. If I want to set a value, I'm going to do 2 parameters. I'm going to say the property name and the value I want to set it to. So I'll come back, I'll use the jQuery function. I'm going to look for the Raptor ID, and I'm going to call the property method. I'm looking for the checked property. I'm going to set it to true. So I provide 2 parameters. If I come back here, refresh the page, select T-Rex, do a get, then do a set, you'll see it goes back to Velociraptor. In this case, it's not much shorter, but if I implemented the full jQuery version like back here, it's much shorter and much easier to use because all the JavaScript jQuery code is in one section. And once you get used to jQuery, most likely you won't want to go back to JavaScript because it does take a lot more code. In some cases, it's not much more code, but in a lot of cases it is, especially when we get into our Ajax lecture. Let's take a look at the last example. Here I'm going to loop through, I'm going to get all the radio buttons, and we're going to re-implement this with jQuery. So here I did get elements by name. In this case, it's a little bit harder with jQuery unless you know how to do this with the selector. Once you know how the selector works, then it's really easy, but it's not going to be the same as up here. So let's take a look at how we can do this. I'm trying to get elements by name, where name is equal to dinosaur. How can I do that with jQuery? Well, I'll still use the jQuery function, but my selector is a little bit different. I'll say I want to select all input types. If I scroll down here, you'll see all these are input types. And I'll put brackets where name is equal to dinosaurs. This is the same as document.getElementsByName. I'm going to select all input types where name is equal to dinosaurs. And what do I want to do? Here I had a for loop. So I'm running through all of them, and then I'm going to print them out. Well, jQuery has its own for loop. It's called the each method. So it's going to go through each of these, and it's going to call this function when one of them are selected. So I usually like to write this in one line to make sure I remember my close bracket and close parenthesis, as well as my semicolon. Once everything's correct, I'll do a new line, and what do we want to run? Well, it's a little bit different now because I'm in a jQuery for loop instead of a JavaScript for loop. First, let's print out the keyword this. Remember in the slides, this referenced the current object. So if I do a console.log and print out this, let's see what it prints out. So I'll do a get all, and you'll see it's actually going to print out DOM objects. So it's going to print out every DOM object that was selected. So you'll actually see it's almost the same HTML as in our raw code, except it's the DOM loaded HTML. We saw that in the previous slides. There's a big difference between the DOM and the HTML code we write, and this is the DOM's version, the rendered HTML code after the DOM has loaded. Well, we can't call functions on this because this is an object after the DOM has loaded, and you don't see any attributes, properties, or functions associated with this. I can't open this up. It's not an object that jQuery can work with. If I do the directory and let's say print out everything with this, do a get all, you'll see I have regular DOM attributes and methods associated with the keyword this, but I can't run the jQuery methods on it. So what about using the jQuery this? If I do a log with the $, and then this inside the jQuery function, so here I'm referencing jQuery, and then I'm referencing the current object. Refresh. Let me put this back to log so you can see the difference. Save the code, refresh the browser, and click on the button, and you'll see it's a little bit different. In this case, it's going to be the DOM object. In this case, it's going to be a jQuery object. And if I open this up, you'll see the jQuery structure and all the prototypes and functions that are associated with it. If I open up the first element, now I have access to the DOM attributes and properties associated with it. So I need to use the jQuery this when using the jQuery for each, and I need to use the DOM this when I'm using the JavaScript or regular DOM object. Once I have that figured out, I can use the jQuery this for each object, because you'll see here I'm referencing an index. I'm saying based off this index, I'm going to reference that radio object. Whereas this one's selecting all radio objects and looping through each one. Now there's a few ways to implement the for each. I can actually put parameters here. The first parameter will be the object, and the second parameter will be the index. However, I can also use the jQuery this function. So let's print this out using the jQuery this function. So I'm going to do a log. I'm going to use the jQuery this to reference the current jQuery object. And you'll see here I'm printing out the ID. So I can call the attribute function to find the ID, concatenate that with a string, set it equal to this other checked property. How do I get checked? I'm going to use the jQuery this, call the prop function, and look for the checked property. Once I'm done, make sure you close the log, make sure you close the prop function, and then make sure you have your semicolon. So this is what it looks like in one line. I'm referencing the current jQuery object, selecting the attribute, concatenating it with this string, and concatenating it with the prop checked value. So if I refresh, do a get all, you'll see Raptor true, Iguanodon false, T-Rex false. So let me comment these out. That way you just see the output. Do a refresh, do a get all, you'll see Raptor true, Iguanodon false, T-Rex is false. Select T-Rex, do a get all, you'll see Raptor false, Iguanodon false, T-Rex true. So it's exactly how it was implemented before. Now if we take these two lines out, you'll see I've implemented this in two lines. And the this keyword is used only when I'm not providing parameters for the each function. If I come to the browser and look at the jQuery each, go to the jQuery API documentation, you'll see the each can take an index and it can also take an element. Okay, so I can actually provide an index and an element, and in that case I wouldn't have to use the this keyword. However, I want to talk about the difference between this and the jQuery this, which is why we implement it this way. Let's take some notes and then we'll go back to the slides and learn some new content. Remember, the jQuery's documentation on the attribute function says to retrieve and change DOM properties such as checked, selected, or disabled state of form elements. Use the prop method. So instead of using the attribute function, we'll use the prop function as we did below. Here, if we provide two parameters, we're going to set the value. And down below, we implemented a selector we've never seen before. If we just want the currently checked radio button, we can be more specific with our CSS like this. However, we want to loop through all of the dinosaurs and check each one. So we use the jQuery function. We look for all input elements where name is equal to dinosaur. That's going to return an object, which is going to be a list, because a name will have multiple input types. We're going to loop through each one. Remember, in this anonymous function, this refers to the DOM object, while $ this refers to the jQuery object. And we saw that if I want to use the jQuery functions, we must use the jQuery object, because these functions are not going to be in the DOM object. So we use the $ this. That's it for this subsection. We're going to go back to the slides. We're going to learn some new concepts, and then we'll take a look at our next real-world example. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.